These are the statutes and rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that the Lord your God of your fathers has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash to pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy the name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go. There you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you.
So when I was 6 years old, my parents gave me a stuffed animal in the shape of a tiger. Tiggy was the name that I affectionately gave to him, and I took Tiggy everywhere. Tiggy was sort of shaped like a pillow, so I would sleep on Tiggy. I took Tiggy with me on road trips. I had conversations with Tiggy. I love Tiggy. And then when I was 8 years old, my family went to Disneyland, and we walked into the gift shop, one of the gift shops at Disneyland, and there were rows and rows of stuffed Mickeys. And my aunt had given me $10 for my birthday, and I already had $2 saved up. And as it turned out, the mid-sized Mickey, there were 3 different sizes. There was like a 3-foot tall Mickey, but that cost like $700,000, you know. And then there was a small Mickey that was cute, and I could afford him, but he was kind of small. But the mid-ranged Mickey, the mid-sized Mickey, like foot-tall Mickey, was exactly $12, and I knew it. It was a sign from the Lord. I bought one of those Mickeys, and Mickey and Tiggy became friends, and I loved them. Mickey became a big part of our family. Used to sort of have sort of an imaginary world, Mouseland. He was married, Minnie, of course, and had children, Matt and Mark. And then there was Max, the evil cat, that would sometimes invade Mouseland and all of this. So anyway, I loved Mickey and I loved Tiggy. And then over the years, I accumulated some more of these stuffed animals. I think there was a lizard. I can't remember. There was a little dolphin, little gray dolphin called Dolphy. And then I think there was a bear. Anyway, so I had all of these stuffed animals, okay? And then when I became a teenager, I found myself reading the Bible. And I came to Deuteronomy chapter 5, the 10 Commandments, and one of the 10 Commandments says this. It says, "Thou shalt not make for yourself an idol. Thou shalt not carve out for yourself some sort of an image in the shape of an animal or anything like this." And so I knew, when I read that, I knew what I had to do. And so I grabbed a hammer, and I smashed those stuffed animals. I smashed Mickey, and I smashed Tiggy until stuffing was sort of oozing out of the wounds. Today we are continuing in our series called 10 in 3, the 10 Commandments in the third millennium. And what we're discovering as we look at the 10 Commandments, actually, really what we're doing is we're going through the book of Deuteronomy, because the book of Deuteronomy helps us to understand better the 10 Commandments. In fact, many scholars see that the structure of the book of Deuteronomy follows the structure of the 10 Commandments, and that each commandment is then unpacked in greater detail as you move through the book of Deuteronomy. So last week we looked at the first commandment, and we saw that it is then unpacked in chapters 6 through 11. And then this week, we're looking at really the second commandment, which is thou shalt not make for yourself an idol. And what we're going to discover is that then chapter 12 helps us to understand that a little bit more. Now, it's precisely at this point, I think, when we read about this notion of thou shalt not have an idol, thou shalt not carve out for yourself statues, that sort of thing. This is where I think one of the main questions that sort of bubbles beneath the surface of this entire series is this question of how is this relevant today? Right? How can something written 3,500 years ago still be relevant today, right? Right? Unless, of course, we do think that the commandment not to make an idol means that you should smash all of your stuffed animals, which, by the way, I made that up. I didn't actually do that. I mean, I did have the stuffed animals, but I didn't smash them with a hammer. That was for dramatic effect, right? I mean, unless we think that somehow having stuffed animals is a violation of this commandment to not have idols, I think many of us are like, I don't get, how this is relevant to me. Most of us, and certainly there are places even in our country, people in our country, and certainly around the world, where people might carve out a stone statue or a wooden statue or something like that. I mean, that's still, but for most Americans, this seems incredibly out of place and irrelevant. But what we need to see, and as we unpack this text in Deuteronomy 12, is that there is a much deeper meaning to what idolatry is all about than just, I think, this sort of superficial understanding that many of us might have. And so what I want to draw out is sort of three observations about the nature of idolatry. Three indications that idolatry might be happening in your life, okay? And the first one is simply this, and really gets at the heart of it. Here we go. Idolatry happens when anything becomes more important to us than God, right? Now, look, I mean, there probably were times as a kid when Mickey, my little stuffed Mickey, he might have become an idol to me. I just loved him. One of those things where, like, if the house was burning down and I had to decide between rescuing my brother or my stuffed animal Mickey, it would have been a tough decision, right? So that's bordering on idolatry, maybe becoming a little bit too important for me. But that's the issue, right? The issue is when something becomes excessively important and ultimately maybe perhaps becomes even as important, if not more important to us than God, then that is when idolatry is happening. Tim Keller, in his book Counterfeit Gods, which discusses this whole issue of idolatry, he identifies three main idols that are present in contemporary culture. Actually, we'll say that not just contemporary culture, throughout history. These three have sort of been maybe the big three idols: money, power, and sex. Money, power, and sex. Three idols, three things that in contemporary and indeed in ancient culture often become more important to us than God, that we look to these things to give us life rather than looking to God himself. We look at this first one, this notion of money being an idol or prosperity and wealth being an idol. What we discover is that is what undergirds precisely the prohibition that is present and articulated here in chapter 12. Verse 3, it says this: "You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their asherim with fire." Right, now let us remember here the Israelites are standing on the banks of the Jordan River. Moses is speaking to them, and he's sort of giving them, well, more than just advice, but he's talking to them before they enter into the land of Canaan, and he's saying, when you go into the land of Canaan, what you're going to discover is this land that has been given to you is covered with idolatry. There are shrines that are set up for the worship of pagan gods. And one of the gods, it talks about, you shall burn their asherim with fire. Asherah was one of the gods that the Canaanites worshipped. Asherah actually you find Asherah appearing in a number of the different pantheons, religious pantheons within the Mesopotamian region in that time. But in the land of Canaan, Asherah was the consort goddess, sort of in relation with Baal, another god that they worship. And what you discover is throughout Old Testament history, Baal was one of the main gods that they were tempted to worship. And so one of the kind of central times when we find this emerging is in the 9th century. There was the king Ahab, and many of you will know the story of King Ahab from the Old Testament. Ahab was the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel had been divided into 2 kingdoms. You had Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Ahab, the king of the north, he fell in love with a Sidonian woman. He fell in love with Jezebel, this Phoenician woman from the town of Sidon, right? The Sidonian woman. You know what they say about the Sidonian woman, right? Sidonian woman, stay away from me. Sidonian woman, you all know what I'm talking about. Don't come knocking at my door. I don't want to see your face no more. Remember that, the Sidonian woman? Yeah, anyway. So Jezebel was this Sidonian woman, and what she did when Ahab got whipped, man, I mean, he totally fell hard for this Sidonian woman, Jezebel, and she enticed him to worship Baal, and in fact, he turned the state religion into worshiping Baal. And of course, this comes to a great confrontation with Elijah, the prophet Elijah, who was a prophet who worshiped Yahweh. And many of you may remember this duel that emerges, right? He challenges the priests of Baal, and he sets up, this altar, and he says to the priests of Baal, he says, see if you can get Baal to ignite this altar. Get Baal to send down fire from heaven and ignite this altar. And so the priests of Baal, they try, they pray, they do all these weird religious things to try to get God, try to manipulate Baal, try to get him to come down and bring down fire from heaven. And it's not working. They just can't get Baal to do this. And Elijah makes fun of him, says, he must be busy, right? Baal must be busy doing something else. Even says, maybe he's stuck in the bathroom, stuck on the toilet, right? I'm not making this up. This is what he says. He's like, Baal's, he's stuck in the bathroom, can't come and bring fire down from heaven to ignite this altar, right? And then what happens? Well, then Elijah prays to Yahweh, and fire comes down from heaven and ignites the altar. And of course, what is that saying? Well, of course, it's saying that Yahweh is the true God. Now, what we need to notice here is there's more to it than just this sort of duel between the two of them. It's important to notice what kind of a God Baal was supposed to be. He was supposed to be able to bring fire down from heaven. He was supposed to be able to bring lightning down. In other words, lightning from a cloud that would come down and ignite the altar. In other words, Baal was known as the storm god, the god of clouds, the god of weather and rain and whatnot. And some of you may know the broader context of that story of Elijah is that there has been a massive famine in the land, and there has been no rain. And after Elijah wins this duel, what happens? He prays to Yahweh, and Yahweh brings clouds, and it rains. You see, the whole thing is about who really does have control over the clouds and the weather and the rain. And here's what we need to remember. In ancient Mesopotamia, how do you make money? It's all through your agricultural products. This was an agricultural society, and the way you would accumulate wealth and prosperity is through having good crop years. And so rain was like money to them. So you see, this is really all about the worship of money and wealth and prosperity. You see, you don't have to have a statue of Baal or an Asherah pole in your house to be an idolater. You see, if money is what you look to, if the pursuit of money or even holding on to what you have financially, and especially if holding on to it or pursuing it entices you to turn away from God and to break his commands and to do things that he wouldn't want you to do in order to hold on to your money or to pursue more money, then that constitutes idolatry. Of course, money isn't the only idol. As I said, Keller identifies 3 big ones. You've got money, and then you've also got power. Right? It's interesting, the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods, they had a god of money. God Artemis was the god of wealth and prosperity. We read about him in the New Testament. Paul kind of gets in trouble for challenging the power of Artemis. But the Romans also had a god of war, god of Eris was his name, god of war and the god of power. But once again, you don't have to have a statue of Eris to be a worshiper of power. Right? Power is just you like having control over things. You know, I think it's important. I know I've noticed throughout my life in election years, and I've heard this time and time again from many politicians over the years, where you'll hear politicians say things like, you know, I just want to serve my country, right? I just want to. I'm here. I'm not in this for the money, right? I could be making so much more money doing something else. Right? Why would I go into politics if it's about money? I could make money somewhere else. And a lot of people are like, oh, look at them. They really care about our country. But we forget that power is just as much an idol as is money. Adolf Hitler didn't actually care about money at all. He wasn't interested in financial prosperity. What was he interested in? He was interested in power. So we need to remember that power is just as much a possible idol as is money. And some of us may even feel that way. I'm not materialistic. I'm not interested in how much money I have. I don't need a bigger house. I'm comfortable with what I have. But I sure do like getting my way. I like having control of the remote control, right? I like being able to watch what I want to watch. Maybe I even like being able to tell people what to do. I like being in management. I like having people underneath me. Some people will go into business and try to rise the corporate ladder, not because they want more money, just because they like the power. They like the control. And that itself can become an idol, especially when, right, now it's about you. It's about you and what you want, and it's about you getting what you want, and about controlling others in that process. And when that happens, you're beginning to worship the idol of power. Money, power, and sex. In the Greco-Roman world, there was the goddess Aphrodite, right? And this was the goddess of sex and romance and romantic relationships. And the idea here with idolatry is that when you look to a relationship and that relationship becomes more important to you than your relationship with God, right, that constitutes idolatry. How do you know that perhaps relationships, that sort of idol is present in your life? Well, there's a number of different signs that is the case. One is that you simply cannot not be in a relationship. Right? You just have to be in a relationship. You feel completely empty and life feels meaningless if there isn't somebody that you're in some sort of a close relationship with. You have to have that, right? It's like you don't, if you don't have that, it's like you don't have air to breathe. You don't have water to drink. It becomes so central to you that you have to have it. And of course, this can cause somebody to jump into a relationship unwisely because that has become a matter of idolatry. Now, another sign that a relationship has become an idol for you is, get this, is you are never satisfied in your relationship. And the reason for this is because you are expecting your partner to give you what only God can give you. That's a pretty big expectation, right? I need you to be God for me. And as long as that's your expectation, is you see they're like God, you're never going to be satisfied if you don't realize that your partner cannot give you everything that you need, and that God is ultimately the one that you need to be looking to. Then you will never be satisfied in a relationship, right? These are just signs that perhaps idolatry is happening in your life. What's interesting is, of course, throughout the ancient world, there were regional gods, right? So they would worship different gods in different regions. So, of course, you have what you had in Egypt. They had Ra, the sun god. In Assyria, they had Ashur, was sort of their local god. You had Marduk, was a god that the Babylonians worshipped, and Moloch was a god that the Moabites worshipped, so on and so forth. These sort of regional gods. And again, we think, well, that we don't have anything like that in our world, right? No, actually, we do. I remember when I lived in Boston, you'll discover that the things they worship are very different than what is worshipped in other places. In Boston, a place like Boston, education becomes an idol. It's all about, where did you get your degree? Did you get your degree at Harvard? You got your PhD at Harvard or MIT, and you think they don't carve out idols? They're the little diplomas that you carve out and you put up on your wall, and you kind of bow down to your idol that gave you this power, right? So in a place like Boston, education can become an idol. Then my wife and I, we lived outside of Manhattan, and education is an issue there too. But, Wall Street is in New York, and what do they worship? They worship money. I have some friends who live in Nashville, and in Nashville you got a bunch of artists, and they're not interested in education. Some of them aren't really all that interested in money. It's all about their artistic expression. It's all about being recognized and noticed for their artistic greatness. You see, idols can manifest themselves regionally just like they did in the ancient world. In Colorado, you might say, I don't know what the idols are here, maybe the outdoors. Some people actually look to outdoor recreational activities can begin to border on the level of idolatry. You see, this kind of idolatry that we see in the ancient world is every bit as present now as it was then. It just takes on a different face. Okay, so what is idolatry? Idolatry happens when anything becomes more important to us than God. Secondly, idolatry happens when we confuse worship of God with the worship of something else. So we get confused and we sort of combine our worship of God with the worship of something else. You'll notice here that when God tells them to go into the land of Canaan, He doesn't just tell them to destroy the Canaanite shrines, but He also tells them don't even worship Yahweh in those places. Okay, notice this. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of that place. Then you shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put His name and make His habitation there. There you shall go. So as we're going to see, ultimately He's saying, you need to come to Jerusalem, to the temple. That's where you worship. Don't even worship God in these pagan places. And it seems that the reason is that God is worried that the distinctiveness of worshiping Yahweh will be lost, and there is the potential for syncretism, that even though they say they're worshiping God, they may actually be worshiping Yahweh, but also now beginning to worship certain things that are actually pagan. And we can see the same thing taking place in our own society. I'll give you an example of this within religious culture. The prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel is this stream, this theological stream that's certainly present in America and around the world. What is it really? Well, it's this idea that, listen, if you follow Jesus, if you surrender your life to Him, then you will become wealthy. He will bless you. You'll become rich. You'll become wealthy, right? And actually, if you're not rich and wealthy, and this is when it really gets bad, if you're not rich and wealthy, well, then you're clearly not following Jesus. Because if you were, you'd be wealthy and you'd be rich. Okay, what's going on there? It's a syncretism. They're saying that they worship Jesus, worshiping God, but now they've sort of combined it with another one of their idols. Right? This is the sort of thing that He is guarding against. I'll give you another example of this. There are other pockets of the church that have taken really an idolatrous attitude towards sexual freedom. And they've combined it with their faith. They say, look, God's a God of love. Jesus is the love of God. And so therefore, people should be able to live. We should love people however they live, and people should be able to live sexually however they want to live. Right? What's going on there? It's a syncretism. They're taking their worship of Jesus and they're combining it with a worship of another idol. And in this case, it's this idea of sexual freedom that goes beyond what is stated biblically. Right? We can find this in a number of different ways. I would say this. So over the last couple weeks, I've been rooting for America in the Olympics, right? Nikola Jokic, I used to root for him. I usually root for Nikola Jokic, but I am not rooting for him now, right? He's playing for Serbia, and I don't want Serbia to win. I'm an American. I'm a patriot. And so, sorry, Nikola Jokic, I want you to lose. Now, that's good. That's patriotism. And as Americans, that's right. Right? What it means to be a patriot is to love your country more than any other country. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful that we don't confuse our love of our country with our love of God. For some people, this can get confused, and they can't seem to separate their love of God from their love of country. And this can manifest itself in things like Bibles that have a cover of the American flag. You see, what this tends to do is distort our understanding. Well, I love God and I love my country, and we can't seem to separate those out to the point where my love of country becomes just as important to me as my love of God. And this is the kind of syncretism that is being warned about in this particular passage. And of course, this is often related really to an idolatrous love of power. We as Americans living in a democracy, we absolutely should use the power that we have, the power of the people to vote. That's appropriate for sure. But we need to remember that the kingdom of God does not depend on political power to be advanced. And so we can't ever compromise our values for the sake of political power. In fact, what you discover, Jesus dealt with this in the first century. There were many Jews who thought that the kingdom of God was going to come through the gaining of political power. This was the zealot movement. And Jesus stood against that. In fact, what you discover, right, is this incredible paradox in the Christian faith. Is that how does God end up gaining power? By relinquishing it. Jesus does not try to gain power over the Romans. He actually submits to their power. And in that humility, what happens? The Roman Empire has been gone for a long time. But guess what isn't? The kingdom of God. So we need to be careful here that we don't take our idolatrous love of power and our idolatrous love of God and combine them in a form of syncretism. Right? The reality is that this sort of syncretism can happen on an individual level, even serving in the church. Right? We can have some people, here's the truth, some people get involved in ministry because there's the possibility of gaining power and having some sort of area, sphere of influence that they can have control over. And oftentimes, one of the ways you'll know that that's become an idol is that they aren't willing to share. They're not willing to give it up. Right? They have to hold on to it themselves. Now, what I want to say is what I'm so encouraged by is that when this church became a Calvary church 3 years ago, it's precisely because the members of First Southern here in Calvary, they said, no, we want to relinquish that. We don't have to hold on to power in this church. That was an incredible sign that it was not an idol in our church. But you can see how this can take place. And the reality is you can justify, right? You can justify it by saying, well, I'm serving the Lord. I'm serving the Lord, and that's why I do this. When is it really because you love the Lord, or is it because you want some sort of power over people or in some sort of an area? It's a sort of syncretism that can occur. So what is it? What is idolatry? Well, in this case, it's when we confuse the worship of God with the worship of something else. Thirdly, idolatry happens when our worship isn't centered on Jesus. Right, it's interesting, again, as I mentioned, when they're coming into the land of Canaan, he doesn't just tell them, hey, destroy the pagan idols, the pagan shrines, don't worship the pagan shrines. And as I mentioned, he even says, don't even worship Yahweh in those places. Instead, what does it say? Here we are in verses 4 through 5. Once again, you shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. Of course, ultimately, what is he talking about? The temple that would be built in Jerusalem. What he's saying is, I want you to worship me there, in that place. And of course, in the temple, part of the idea was that the worship could be regulated there. It could be protected against the worship of idols. Unfortunately, even that didn't work because pagan worship did end up at times making its way into the temple. But that was the idea, was that through worshiping in the temple, then the sanctity of worshiping Yahweh could be protected. Because the temple, and throughout the Old Testament, what you discover is the temple is the place where heaven and earth intersect. That's what the temple is all about. heaven and earth are separated because of our sin. We have turned away from God, so there is this gap between humanity and God. There's a separation between heaven and earth, and the temple becomes the place where heaven and earth once again intersect. Now, of course, what we discover in the New Testament, and I don't have time to go into great detail on this, but what we discover is that Jesus then replaces the temple. Jesus becomes the place where heaven and earth intersect, right? There's a famous passage where he talks about the temple being destroyed and how it will be rebuilt, and everybody thinks he's talking about the actual temple in Jerusalem, but then it goes on to say he's talking about his body. What he was doing is, in somewhat of a secretive way, saying, listen, I now am the place where heaven and earth intersect. And this is why he could offer forgiveness of sins to people as he went around Galilee, forgiving sins. Well, wait a minute. You're supposed to go to the temple for that. What he was saying is that now I am the place where heaven and earth intersect. And, of course, we see this is put, I think, very clearly in the book of Colossians, where it says this, for in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. See, he's saying in Jesus, the fullness of God has come. Heaven and earth intersect in him. And of course, why is this possible? This is possible precisely because of his death on the cross. We see even in the passage that was just read in Deuteronomy, it talks about bringing sacrifices before God. What we discover is that the entire Old Testament sacrificial system was really symbolic, and it was pointing to what God would do in Jesus. What it pointed to was the reality that we need forgiveness, that we have sinned and we have turned away from God. But the reality is that actual forgiveness can only come if God himself absorbs the weight of our offense. If you think about how forgiveness works, the way you forgive somebody is whatever. They break your window, it's going to cost $250, and you say, look, I forgive you. You don't have to fix the window. Well, what just happened? You just absorbed the $250 that, I'm sure it's probably more than that these days. Windows are expensive, right? You just absorbed the weight of that offense. And this is the point here. All of this sacrificial system, it symbolized the need for that, but the only way forgiveness could really be procured is if God himself absorbed the weight of our sin, and this is precisely what Jesus does on the cross. God, in Jesus, the place where the fullness of God dwells, on the cross, he dies to forgive us of our sin, enabling us to enter into his presence, right? And this is why all worship must be centered around Jesus. And of course, it's significant, right? Jesus as a person, right? Because isn't it true that one of the things that we tend to idolize is people? We elevate people to positions of almost deity, and they become what we look to. They we look to, whether it's a close friend or a parent or a leader. We begin to look to them as having some sort of great power and significance. I was just reading about Julius Caesar and how he managed to basically disrupt democracy in the Roman Empire and became the first emperor of Rome. And of course, how did he do it? Well, the people just fell in love with him. They just loved him. They loved everything that he did. They didn't care that he was breaking the rules. They didn't care that he was going against their law. They didn't care about that. They just thought he was so amazing that they wanted him to be in power. And so we see this over and over again, this tendency to idolize him. In fact, Julius Caesar was later seen to be divine, the Son of God. And so we see this tendency to idolize people, and this is why, once again, worship must center on Jesus. Because Jesus alone is truly God. He's the one person you can worship and it not be idolatry. I mean, we have a TV show, a famous TV show, American Idol. I mean, that's what it's called. We literally worship people of great success and we almost divinize them, right? I mean, look, Swifties, I don't know. I was starting to wonder. Some Swifties sounds to me like idolatry, the kind of affection and love that is poured out towards Taylor Swift. The idea here is, look, it's fine to love people and to think they're great, but Jesus, right? He's the one that we worship. He is the ultimate object of our affection. What is idolatry? Idolatry happens when anything becomes more important than God. Idolatry happens when we confuse the worship of God with the worship of something else. And idolatry happens when it isn't centered around Jesus. Friends, we showed you that video of church camp that the kids just went to. And of course, as I mentioned, it drew me back to my own days attending a church camp very similar in Wyoming. You've probably all heard of the book, Everything I Really Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. You guys all heard of that book, right? Well, I don't know if that's true, but here's what I do know. Everything I really needed to know, I learned at church camp. Because it was at church camp that I came to know Jesus. And I'll never forget that moment when I realized in him I have everything that I need. And there's a sense in which throughout my life, my life has just been this struggle to not be pulled away from that, to not be pulled into idolatry, to not be pulled into feeling like I have to have or I need to have something else when really all that I need to have is Jesus. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity, once again, to turn to the true God, to turn away from all idols and recognize the one true God who revealed himself in the person of Jesus. The bread and the cup represent the body and the blood of Christ, pointing to the reality of the love of this God who gave himself for us, loves us, forgives us, that no matter how far we have turned away from him, no matter how much we have slipped into idolatry, he loves us and forgives us and welcomes us back into his presence.